Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast, where we dive into books, stories, people, and tons of different topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe, and yes, we have a new name for the podcast. Let's Learn. Why have I changed the name of the podcast? Because it's just more than stories and books. It's tons of different topics. So as we go forward, you never know what the next episode will be. So, let's learn today about the Boston Massacre. It happened in 1770 on March 5th. And yes, it's an amazing story. It's a horrible story, and it's a story you have to know about. So we will talk about what led up to that fateful night. We will talk about the moment-to-moment details as to what happened when 5 patriots were killed by British soldiers in downtown Boston. And yes, we will talk about the aftermath, the actual trial against these British soldiers. And they were defended by our future president, John Adams, and a lot of people ultimately talk about the trial afterwards being the lasting legacy of this horrible night. The basis of our foundations, of our rights as citizens, ultimately came out of this trial, and it's a fascinating story. We went to war against our King George in Britain in 1775. The next year in 1776, we declared independence from Britain. But you could argue that it all started on this night, cold night of March 5th, 1770. And why did this massacre occur on this particular night? Because a British soldier was late paying his bill for his wig. Well, let's go back to the beginning. When, where, how, why did all of this end up happening? Well, children, as adults know, you may have heard this expression. This particular night, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because of everything that led up to this moment. And to understand that, you have to know the past leading up to it. So where does the story begin? It begins with Christopher Columbus in 1492. He found this whole new world. And what happened after that? All the powers at the time in Europe said, wow, this is brand new land. We have to get involved. We have to have a part of this new land. So the French came, the Spanish came, and yes, ultimately years later, finally the British came. We were subjects of Britain. Britain established a colony in Virginia, and they ultimately set up a lot of areas that they controlled along the east coast of our present-day United States. Well, Spanish, they had come first, but they had set up areas that they controlled in the south, in Florida, in present-day California, present-day Mexico. The French, well, they settled in the middle of our present-day United States. And they were primarily involved with trading furs. So ultimately, the French and us, Britain, started arguing over who was going to control this new territory, this whole brand new world. I mean, this was new for the new world, but this wasn't new in Europe. Britain and France had been arguing for 700 years and fighting with each other, going all the way back to 1066 when William the Conqueror took over England. They did not like each other. And now here they are in this brand new world. Who's going to control it? And the argument started over this area in present-day Ohio, in this Ohio River Valley. It was all about who is going to control the river. Who controlled the river would control everything in terms of moving goods and economic value, making money, boys and girls. But here was the problem. You had both people that were from France speaking a different language, and you had people from Britain speaking a different language, and here they are meeting up in present-day Pittsburgh. Well, We said, no, this is our land because this was Western Virginia, the colony of Virginia. So the governor, his name was Robert Dinwiddie, he sent a 21-year-old guy. You may have heard of him. His name was George Washington. He delivered this letter to the French that basically said, you need to leave this land. This is ours. The French said, forget it. Get out of here. George Washington went back, told his superiors, and a year later, George Washington again was out there. He led an attack against some French soldiers. 10 French soldiers were killed. This was the beginning of a war against France. It was called the French and Indian War. And it lasted for years, up until 1763. We beat the French. We won. Hooray! But there was a problem. King George of Britain had spent too much money trying to win this war. He didn't have any more money left. He was out of money. So what did he do to get more money? He taxed us. He taxed us, the colonists, in the New World. But it wasn't really about the taxes. Yes, this was brand new. We didn't enjoy it. The merchants didn't like it. This was taking money out of their pocket. But the big problem was that the king never had us involved, never had us as part of the solution. He basically said, hey, guess what? You're going to pay this tax whether you like it or not. Imagine this. This is the comparison, boys and girls. You're a teenager, you're now of age, you're 18 years old, and you now have gotten your independence. Your life has been a certain way all these years. And now your parents are telling you, you don't have any more freedoms, you can't leave the house, and you have to abide by what I'm saying? And you're an adult now, and you're saying, no, talk to me, I'll understand this, and we'll get along, but no, this is the way it is. And this is the King of England, and this is what he said to the colonists at this time. And this organization in around Boston, they gave themselves the name Sons of Liberty. Well, they didn't like these taxes at all. This was known as no taxation without representation. Hey, if you're going to tax us, let us be involved. Let us be part of your government in coming up with ways to raise money. But no, King George didn't do this. So immediately after the war, in succession, 1764, the Sugar Act, tax on sugar. The next year, tax on stamps, anything, any official papers. That was a bad one. The Sons of Liberty and everyone around Boston created lots of problems for the tax collectors. I mean, basically, boys and girls, any paper that was issued, at the time you're talking about official documents like contracts, but wills, marriage licenses, even newspapers, playing cards, even dice, you had to pay a tax. This drove the colonists crazy. It was ultimately gotten rid of, but at the same time, Parliament and King George basically said, you know what? There's this new law in place, and it's called the Declaratory Acts. In other words, we're going to tax you whenever we want. Now, this is fascinating. Around this time, there was the person in charge basically under the king was this fellow by the name of William Pitt. And yes, we mentioned him earlier. Pittsburgh was ultimately named after him. Why? He was a hero. For us on our side, he beat the French. He was in charge during the war. And it was during this time, he actually supported a lot of what the colonists were arguing back and forth with us on. He was on our side, so to speak. But he was sick, even though he was in charge. He had gout, which children basically is an inflammation of the joints. It's really painful. And along with that, he must have had a tough life because basically he went into deep depression where he was gone for months at a time. He wasn't able to run the government. They said he was actually insane. So his second in command, a fellow by the name of Charles Townshend, it was his job to come up with money for the king. And so he passed this new law, this new tax in 1767. Listen to everything that was taxed: glass, lead, oil, paint, paper, tea. And the colonists again went crazy. And it's here that our story about the Boston Massacre really begins. This was the last straw. The Sons of Liberty and merchants in Boston basically boycotted everything coming from Britain to punish them. They just said, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. So they set up this agreement for a couple of years. On August 1st, 1768, they called it the Non-Importation Agreement. No exporting of anything to Britain and no importing of anything from Britain. And here's where it all started. This agreement not to buy British goods expired at the end of the year, except for 8 businesses in Boston. One businessman, he was a dry goods retailer. Boys and girls, it's basically a store that sold pretty much everything in town. Clothes, pots and pans, you name it. His name was Theophilus Lilly. He did not agree, and he started selling items. Sons of Liberty and the people around Boston put up signs in front of all these 8 businesses, his being one of them. Well, this fellow by the name of Ebenezer Richardson, who was not well liked because he was one of the tax collectors in town. He was on the customs board. So what did he do? He took his horse and carriage and he ran over this sign in front of Lilly's business. A mob ended up surrounding him, chased him into his house, threw rocks and everything, clubs, sticks at him, and he came out with a gun. And he shot into the crowd, killing a 12-year-old boy. His name was Christopher Sider, and 4 days later, thousands and thousands of people in Boston showed up for his funeral. So tension is running high, especially with the common folk in Britain and with these soldiers. And it's important to back up for a second. Why did they despise the soldiers? Well, when King George sent them to Boston, there was no place for them to live. So they were required by law, the people of Boston were required to take them in, feed them, house them. They weren't getting reimbursed. These families and these homeowners weren't getting reimbursed. So they forcefully had to take in these soldiers. And on top of that, they were taking jobs away from a lot of the younger teenagers and apprentices in the town. But in a way, to defend some of these soldiers, a lot of them turned the other way. And there was no police force. It's just important to remember as well. Even though all these soldiers were actually in Boston, their job wasn't to maintain law and order. It was just basically to keep the colonists in line, but they weren't actually actively going out and arresting people. So there was a lot of lawlessness, boys and girls. Basically, people just attacking customs officials, people collecting the taxes, and the king's representatives, who were the soldiers. To make things worse during this time period, immediately after the funeral, the newspapers were talking about this Battle of Golden Hill that happened in New York City, more riots from the people, common people that were attacking the tax collectors. So this is the environment that ultimately led us into the next week when the Boston Massacre happened. It was a Friday night first, on March 2nd. A British soldier by the name of John Walker was walking down the street, and this fellow by the name of John Gray, who worked for this rope walk company, they made ropes. He yelled out to Walker, "Hey, you need a job?" And he said, yeah, I do need a job. And then he basically said, "Why don't you come in here and clean up my toilet?" At which point, friends, he did not say toilet. You can imagine what he said. It's argued as to what exactly the words that were said, because it was a he said. But ultimately, they both went at it. Riots ended up happening. People from the town came out. Walker got his comrades and his soldiers out there. No one died, but there were a lot of injuries. A lot of people went to the hospital. And going into then that Sunday, March 4th, things started dying down. And as the sun came up on Monday morning, March 5th, word got out that a lot of the soldiers were going to come out and start burning houses down. The tension was in the air. As it got dark, and I mean dark, there were no street lights during this time. The only way you could see was by candlelight. A fellow by the name of Captain John Goldfinch, a British soldier, was walking down King Street, present-day State Street, in front of the old State House, the Customs House where they collected money. A British soldier by the name of John Goldfinch was walking down the street. A wig maker's apprentice, a 13-year-old boy by the name of Edward Garrett, happened to see him. He knew him. He hadn't paid his bill, or at least he didn't think he did. So he called out to him, Look at there he goes, a deadbeat, doesn't pay his bills. Goldfinch, to his credit, kept on walking, ignored him. But a Private Hugh White, who was guarding the Customs House, overheard Garrett and confronted him. He's a gentleman. He pays his bills. Garrett, this teenage boy, goes right back at him. There's no gentleman in your ranks. Incensed, White shouts at him, Get up here, let me see your face. In the dark, Garrett goes right up. Here I am. And immediately, across the face, smack, with the butt of his rifle, White clocks him. Garrett goes down. He screams. At that point, all of their teenage boys that were with Garrett surround him. Rocks start throwing. Insults starts being thrown. A church bell is rung. Everyone that's nearby surrounds White. White backs up to the front door of the Customs House. He starts banging, let me in, let me in. No one lets him in. At that point, he loads his musket. His bayonet is ready. And that is when he calls out the guard. Call out the guard! Only 100 yards away, down the street. The soldiers that were in charge of patrolling that area were there, led by a Captain Thomas Preston. They did not immediately go. He waited for a good half hour, hoping that the crowds would disperse. The stress and the anxiety of everything that was happening would dissipate. Nothing happened. More and more people, hundreds at this point, were surrounding, throwing just not rocks, ice, snowballs, anything. At that point, Preston moves forward to defend, help White. 7 soldiers altogether. They fixed their bayonets, unloaded. Their muskets were not loaded. They formed a semicircle, pushing through the crowd, semicircle in front of White. Insults, everything's being shouted back and forth. You can imagine the scene. Chaos. At that point, White makes the fateful decision to load the muskets. They are ready. And then a club ends up hitting a Private Hugh Montgomery in the head. He goes down. The musket goes down. He stands up and he shoots into the crowd. More shots are fired. Seconds before this, Preston was actually hit. The attacker actually went to hit his head, and he slipped on the ice, and he ended up just brushing his arm. When everyone is down at this point, Preston stands up. Why did you fire? We thought you said fire. Chaos again. Everything. People disperse. Everyone's in shock. They attend to the wounded. Preston and his men go back to their barracks. We don't know exactly when, but shortly after that, the governor, Thomas Hutchinson, comes to the State House, comes up on the stairs, trying desperately to calm the situation, have it end, basically says, these men, soldiers, will be prosecuted. They murdered people. We will account for them. The law should have its course. Things seemed to settle down in the aftermath. 5 people passed away, 3 immediately, and 2 a week, 2 weeks later. Crispus Attucks was an African-American man. He was a mariner. He was a dock worker. People consider him the first person that passed away in the American Revolution. Samuel Gray, a rope maker, passed away. A sailor by the name of James Caldwell passed away. The next morning, Samuel Maverick, a 17-year-old apprentice, passed away. And then 2 weeks later, Patrick Carr, an Irish immigrant and tailor, passed away. His testimony prior to passing away on his deathbed became so important to understanding what happened on that fateful night. The next morning, Captain Preston and all the soldiers were arrested, and it set the stage for the pivotal, historic trial that followed. Why was it historic? Because even during this time of mob mentality, you are guilty before you're innocent. A fellow by the name of John Adams, a patriot, was called forth to actually defend all of these soldiers. He did. And he set the precedent for establishing guilt through evidence, that no one is guilty unless proven otherwise. In his famous quote at the trial, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of the facts and evidence." What happened at the end of this trial? 2 people were convicted. 2 soldiers were convicted of manslaughter. Everyone else was found not guilty. Why? Because John Adams, established that there was beyond a reasonable doubt that these soldiers, as much as everyone would wanted to have them found guilty, they were defending the State House. The State House had most of the money in Boston, right there in that building. They were surrounded by a mob. Yes, they contributed to everything that happened, but for the most part, the facts stood there, with the guilty soldiers being Hugh Montgomery and Matthew Kilroy, the 2 soldiers that shot into the crowd, that killed these men. But even Captain Preston, he was later found not guilty in a separate trial because it could not be proven that he actually said to fire. Montgomery and Kilroy were found guilty. They didn't go to jail. Interestingly enough, at the time, Old England, if this was your first offense, you had this law that they invoked called the benefit of clergy. It was a legal loophole and basically said, if you could read your first offense, guess what? Your punishment in this case, that you were branded on your right thumb with the letter M for manslaughter. Interestingly enough, both of these soldiers went back to the regiment, and the historical record is such that we don't know what happened to them. They were lost to time and history. The same thing with Garrett, the teenager that started everything. He was lost to history. There's no records of what happened to him, where he passed away, where he went, the rest of his life. It's as if they just all disappeared. Now think of this. What was interesting during this time was in terms of getting the cause out for the Patriots against the monarchy and King George and everything that they had perpetrated in terms of taxes, the suppression of liberty, taxation without representation. This events could have been just something locally that happened. But Paul Revere, yes, the famous Paul Revere, ended up copying a drawing by this Boston artist, Henry Pelham. He engraved it into a copper plate copied it, ended up sending out the version of this horrible night. He titled this engravement, "The Bloody Massacre Perpetrated in King Street." It had really, looking back on it, based on the trial, based on the facts, number one, the printing was as if it happened during the day. All the soldiers were lined up, shooting into an unarmed group of people from Boston, when that was not the case. It was a mob. Ultimately, this print, this engraving, was sent out through all the colonies, again, furthering the patriot cause, solidifying this horrible night as the beginning of what became the American Revolution and what became of the United States of America. So, to wrap up our podcast on the Boston Massacre, here are the top 5 most interesting what-if facts. Number 5, it took up to 4 months to get information back and forth from the colonies to King George and vice versa. If they were in the same room, if they could literally talk to each other within minutes, within even a day or two. Would have any of this ever happened? Would we be the United States of America? And certainly, would the tension surrounding what was happening in Boston ever happen? Number 4, Ebenezer Richardson, the gentleman that ended up running over the sign in front of Theophilus Lilly's yard, the sign that said importer. He was against the patriot cause. He ended up running back to his house because of what he did. The colonists, the people in Boston, threw rocks into his house. He came out of the house and shot into the crowd, killing that young boy, Christopher Sider, which ultimately, days later, led up to the Boston Massacre. Number 3, yes, the gentleman I just referenced, Theophilus Lilly. If it wasn't for him, he was one of the 8 businessmen that refused to continue boycotting goods from Britain. He purposely wanted to start selling again these products from Britain. He actually had a sign put out in front of his house by the Sons of Liberty saying, "Don't frequent this business. He's an importer." If it wasn't for him, Ebenezer Richardson wouldn't have ultimately come to his defense. Number 2, William Pitt, the gentleman that was for the patriot cause in many respects. He was in charge with King George, and if he hadn't been sick, who knows what ultimately would have happened, because Charles Townshend took over. He's the one that set up the Townshend Acts, which was all the taxes on all those items that ultimately, again, led to the stress and the riots in the street in Boston. And finally, the number 1 most interesting what-if fact about the Boston Massacre was Captain John Goldfinch. If he had paid his bill for cleaning his wig on time, Edward Garrick wouldn't have said anything as he walked by him. But Edward Garrick didn't even know at the time that he had paid it. He had the receipt in his pocket. What if he had paid his wig bill on time? Thanks for staying with me on this journey, all about the Boston Massacre. Friends, please reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com for questions, anything, comments, feedback. And if you could rate and review me on Apple Podcast or any podcast platform that you listen to. This has been Kevin O'Keefe with the OK, Let's Learn podcast, and keep learning.